delighted to welcome you to this session of the 15th Jaipur Literature Festival, protected by Dettol, Banega Swasth, India. It's our pleasure to present now Fracture of a Subcontinent, Munizae Jahangir, Aasha Mehreen Amin, and Radhika Ramaseshan in conversation with Jyoti Malhotra. The fracture of the Indian subcontinent in 1947 into India and Pakistan, and subsequently in 1971, the further division of Pakistan and formation of an independent nation, Bangladesh, continues to cast a shadow on the present. As India and Pakistan enter the 75th year of their independence, they remain hostile twins, while Pakistan and Bangladesh are barely able to tolerate each other. And yet, despite the inability of their governments to come to terms with their past, the people of India and Pakistan, less so between Pakistan and Bangladesh, seem to still be able to summon up the reserves of some normalcy. The world offers several models for resolving conflicts. Germany and Ireland come to mind. In the divided Indian subcontinent, though, the past is not just always present. The present is often a crutch for the pain of remembered memory. How then can the Indian subcontinent achieve its full human and creative potential? Perhaps the 75th anniversary of its fracture is a good start for an honest conversation. Munizae Jahangir is a broadcast journalist and documentary filmmaker, currently anchoring a flagship current affairs show, Spotlight with Munizae Jahangir, on Aaj TV, one of Pakistan's leading news media networks. She's a co-founder and editor-in-chief of voicepk.net and was the first Pakistani journalist to have reported for an Indian news channel, NDTV, as their country correspondent for 10 years. Jahangir's high-profile interviews include Hillary Clinton, Sadiq Khan, Benazir Bhutto, Nawaz Sharif, and Malala Yousafzai. She was honored as a young global leader by the World Economic Forum and is a founding member of South Asian Women in Media. Aasha Mehreen Amin is the head of editorial and opinion and a senior deputy editor of the Daily Star, Bangladesh, and has been working for the paper for the last 31 years. She was former editor of The Star, a weekly magazine of the Daily Star, for which she also wrote a satirical column, Postscript. Amin currently writes on human rights and social trends in her column, No Strings Attached. Radhika Ramaseshan has been a journalist since the 80s after completing a master's in English literature from Bombay University. She's worked out of Mumbai, Guwahati, and Lucknow before settling down in Delhi in magazines, news weeklies, and dailies. Ramaseshan is currently a consulting editor with Business Standard and a columnist for the Tribune and TOI+. Currently, she's working on a book on Uttar Pradesh's political history. Jyoti Malhotra has been a journalist for more than 35 years and currently works as a consulting editor with The Print, where she writes a column on India's foreign policy and anchors 2 video shows on Indian politics and foreign affairs. Previously, Malhotra has worked with several media in a variety of languages, both in India and abroad, including the Indian Express, the Times of India, and BBC. Please feel free to send in your comments by typing them in the comment section. Please do follow our social media handles to get notifications on the upcoming sessions. Do tweet using hashtag Jaipur Literature Festival 2022 and tag @JaipurLitFest. Ladies and gentlemen, Fracture of a Subcontinent, Munizae Jahangir, Aasha Mehreen Amin, and Radhika Ramaseshan in conversation with Jyoti Malhotra.
I am deeply privileged today to moderate this session with women journalists from across the subcontinent, Munizae Jahangir from Pakistan, Aasha Mehreen Amin from Bangladesh, currently in Boston, Radhika Ramaseshan in New Delhi, and I, Jyoti Malhotra, I'm in New Delhi, of course. And it's I'm connecting the time zones. Munizae is in Pakistan, in Delhi, in Boston/Bangladesh. And today we're talking about the subcontinent, the Indian subcontinent. The fracture of the subcontinent is our theme today. And as India and Pakistan enter the 75th anniversary of independence or partition, of course, Bangladesh became independent in 1971, a new country 50 years ago, and Bangladesh is celebrating, in fact, the entire region is celebrating Bangladesh's 50th anniversary of independence. What better than to have 3 women journalists from across the region to discuss the crises that still affect all our lives across 1.6 billion people across these 3 nations. So let me also say that all these women journalists are also members of, we are part of a women's journalist network called South Asian Women in the Media. And some of you who have who are much younger, I'm of course much older than some of you, but you have led very interesting lives in the sense of being participants in your country. You are not just the spokespeople, but voices on the ground. So can I start with you, Munizae Jahangir, to ask you about the ongoing bitterness between India and Pakistan. We are both 75 years old. Some would have thought that, we are no longer sort of twins separated at birth, but middle-aged people actually. And so your experience as a young woman journalist in Pakistan and what you think of the fracture of the subcontinent and what it means to you.
Well, Jyoti, the last time I came to Pakistan years ago, almost 5 years ago, to attend my wedding, I think one of the biggest change that we have seen with the current government in India is that the borders have been firmly closed to people-to-people contact. Of course, there is in Kartarpur, the worshippers are allowed to come, the prisoners are freed once now and then, but actually the people-to-people contact where people met each other, where they were allowed to cross the border due to COVID, due to very strict regimes on either side of the divide, people who may not want to have move forward in a friendly manner forward, the borders remain closed. I think that is one of the biggest differences that we have seen in the last few years. And in fact, when I started journalism, there was the Musharraf regime, but they had, after Kargil war, he was very keen to start CBMs, composite building measures. At that time they were called, between India and Pakistan, and I saw the biggest prisoner exchange happen for the first time on Wagah-Tari border. Similarly, we saw the 2 Kashmirs being opened, the borders between the 2 Kashmirs for the first time in history being opened, and families meeting one another. One mother met her daughter after almost 40 years. And I thought to myself, what kind of countries are these? These are cruel countries where they do not allow a mother to meet her own daughter when she lives only 30 kilometers away from her. So I think in Pakistan and India have held back their population from benefiting from one another, not just the meeting points where families are divided, where friends are divided, where long-term relations are divided, but also in terms of the youth. I think recently between India and Pakistan, we have seen the students' movement. And there was this one song, Hum Dekhenge, by Faiz Ahmad Faiz, which transcended boundaries. The students in Delhi sang it out, and they talked about having free student unions, having free speech. Similarly, students in Pakistan sang it out, and in solidarity with the students in Delhi, recognizing that they're singing the same song. So I think that both India and Pakistan, our struggles have been the same. Our states have subjugated freedom of speech almost equally on either side of the divide, and the movements have recognized the struggle on either side, whether it's women's movement, whether it's the farmers movement, whether it's the students movement. But what has happened is that we have not been able to convince the states to experience life together as South Asians. So I think that is what has really changed in the last 5 years, that though we have suffered separately, we have not been allowed to make those bridges as we were allowed even under dictatorial regimes in Pakistan.
Right. I think that's very beautifully put, Munizae, that that, we've suffered separately, but not been allowed to suffer together in a sense, because we cannot even cross the borders. But even as you speak, you're absolutely right. I think I last met you when I came for your wedding 5 years ago. And just a few months ago, when you held the Aasha Jahangir conference in memory of your mother, who of course was this fiery activist, human rights activist, and lawyer, and a role model for all of us across South Asia. It was such a pity that I wasn't able to get a visa. Several of us weren't able to get a visa to come.
But none of you were given a visa.
Absolutely, none of us were given a visa.
So it's not just your side, it's our side as well that wants the borders firmly closed.
Yes, absolutely. So Aasha Mehreen, can I come to you and ask you, we talk about this bitterness between India and Pakistan that Munizae has referred to, and how, young people, old people, people who want to go back homes, I think we want to be normal nations. I don't think we need to love each other or hate each other. Let's just be normal neighbors. And fortunately, India and Bangladesh don't have these issues that India and Pakistan have. But I want to ask you about the relationship between Bangladesh and Pakistan. Why do you think it is still so bitter?
Well, the obvious answer would be because, we have not received an official apology from the government, from the state. And
from the state of Pakistan.
From the state of Pakistan. So that is obviously the very basic, premise for any kind of, relationship to improve. So that, I guess, has been the main problem with this. I mean, with the fact that there's absolutely a kind of disconnect with Pakistan. And the other thing is that, because you see, we're still relatively a new country. I mean, we're 50 years old, so there's a lot of the trauma of the liberation war and all the atrocities that happened. I mean, there are still people living now who actually experienced it themselves. And or very close loved ones have suffered because of that. So it's just too raw even now. So at least the least that we would expect is an apology from the state. Now there has been a lot of attempts.
What do you want Pakistan to say to you, and what should they apologize for?
For all the atrocities, for the genocide, for the rapes, on innocent civilians. I mean, it was completely, uncalled for, and there was. I mean, that just I think under any international law, I mean, that is considered a complete violation of human rights, and I mean, it's genocide. So, I mean, that's what we want. We want apology for the genocide, for the atrocities, for the rapes.
And that memory is still very much alive in Bangladesh?
It is alive. And another thing is that, the liberation war is very much, it's sort of, for Bangladeshis, it's like a landmark, and it's a very important part of our history. So it's basically the beginning of our birth. So people are extremely emotional about it. And we've also, and rightly so, we've managed to retain this emotion and pass it on to our future generations, which is wonderful, because that is probably the only time I would say that the people of this region of Bangladesh, they were completely united and completely,
Right.
in harmony.
Okay.
Which is not the case right now.
Right.
But
So
I think we want to sort of go back to that point, and that's kind of like the standard for us. That's what we want to achieve.
Okay.
I think so. So that's the reason.
Right. So I'm going to ask Munizae the same question, but hold your thoughts for a minute, Munizae. Radhika Ramaseshan, can I bring you in here? You know, you're one of India's ablest political commentators. You've covered the BJP for decades. And I want to ask you if you can perhaps sort of stitch this all together. I mean, you know, in today's India, for example, go to Pakistan. You don't like somebody, and especially amongst the right-wing parties, I'm not going to name one or two or three, but, you know, say so you don't like something, you say, "Acha, Pakistan chale jao, go to Pakistan." Jinnah, for example, you know, it's almost like, again, you don't like your political opponent, you say this is sort of part of he's a Jinnah loving person. Why is it that 75 years after independence, that even today, that we think of, you know, or some people think of Pakistan in these terms?
Yeah, a very interesting question, Jyoti. Thank you. But, you know, it was not always like this. Of course, I mean, I obviously am not from the partition era or the phase immediately after partition. And I'm also fortunate to come from a part of India which is relatively untouched, which is totally untouched by memories of partition, that is Tamil Nadu. I think it's one of the few states, you know, a few Muslims may have gone to Pakistan. I don't know, but even today, the concept of ghettoization that was brought about by a partition, the separation of communities physically, metaphorically, every which way is not there in Tamil Nadu. You know, Hindus and Muslims intermingle. Muslims speak Tamil. In fact, they prefer to speak Tamil. There was an effort to propagate Urdu in Tamil Nadu, but most Muslims prefer to speak Tamil. I mean, the food habits are very similar. The sartorial habits are also quite similar. So there's very little to distinguish the communities, except that they have their own religious places. And mind you, Tamil Nadu, I would regard as the most religious state in the country from the point of view of Hindus. I mean, at the crack of dawn, you hear the temple bells pealing and people going to, you know, do their worship with coconut and flowers or whatever.
Right.
But the best part is that Tamil Nadu has segregated politics from religion.
So why is it that in the north, you know, especially if you look at today's election scenario, I mean, we're in the middle of these.
I'm coming to it, yeah.
Yeah, go ahead.
Yeah, absolutely. Now you come to the north. I think, you know, in the early years when one was growing up in, say, the mid-60s and 70s, it seemed like a young nation that was fired by this whole concept of nation building. And I do think that was the big achievement of our founding fathers. Think of all the carnage and the convulsions that this country went through after partition. And, you know, I think in 61, the first communal riot was in 61 in Jaipur in Madhya Pradesh. Until then, there was no serious communal riot. And even if you watch the films of that era, it's all about nation building, you know, building dams, building institutions. So it's something to be said about the founding fathers that they managed to shift the discourse from negativity to positivity. And I'm not compartmentalizing these terms in black and white, but that's how it happened. And the party that we referred to was a very peripheral force. From the beginning, they tried to hammer this whole, the messages emanating from partition and, you know, tried to play on the sentiments of Hindus, but somehow they could never make a mark in the elections for a long time. It was really with the rise of the BJP that partition became an integral part of the political discourse in India, and it continues even today. There is no getting away with it. Since you mentioned,
why is that? That's my question. Why is it that today's BJP, which perhaps and the leaders in today's BJP are actually neither from Bengal nor from Punjab, so they don't have any first-hand experience of partition. Unlike, for example, India's former Prime Minister Inder Kumar Gujral, who was a victim of partition. He was a refugee from Pakistan. His experience is so different from today's leadership across Dr. Manmohan Singh, again, he has first-hand experience of partition. But today's BJP or so many other leaders in the other political parties, they don't have that experience. So why is it that they're unable to move on?
Yeah, I think the answer is that the RSS, which is the ideological parent of the BJP, was built by the refugees from Pakistan, primarily. If you go to small towns in, say, Uttar Pradesh or anywhere in North India and try to trace the genesis of the RSS, I always found that it was founded by the Punjabis who came from the other side of the border. And it was definitely a reaction to partition. And in their own way, they have tried to keep the memories alive, collectively. Now, talking about the leaders, I think Advani definitely, Mr. L.K. Advani was definitely from Pakistan. In fact, I accompanied him on his, I think the first and only trip that he made after leaving Pakistan. But that was a different Advani, sentimental, nostalgic, and so on. Anyway, the early founders of the Jansangh and the BJP were mostly those who were connected in some way or the other with Pakistan. Mm-hmm. Either they came from Pakistan or their parents came from Pakistan. So the core was all about Pakistan in the Jansangh, and that carried on to the BJP. Now, in the present leadership, you have two powerful leaders from Gujarat. But very ironically, Gujarat is one state whenever I've gone to Gujarat or Ahmedabad, if I have to travel to the walled city, the auto wala or the cabbie will invariably ask me, "Aapko Pakistan jana hai kya?" I mean, that's how deeply internalized geography, history, memories, everything is in people. I mean, that's how they refer to the walled city, which is inhabited mostly by Muslims who probably have nothing to do with Pakistan. Maybe their ancestors, some of them probably migrated there, but that's about it. But they are bracketed as Pakistanis. And, the same kind of attitude has spilled over in Uttar Pradesh. It never happened in Uttar Pradesh. Muslims were not really referred to as
they were not demonized.
Yeah, but of late, I find that any Muslim mohalla is referred to as Pakistan in common parlance. अच्छा, वहां जाना है क्या? वहां तो मीट बिकता है. वहां लोग ऐसे हैं, वैसे हैं. I mean, every possible stereotyping is done, which is again rooted in Pakistan. So that's how visceral, how deep the whole division goes. And it helps the BJP, it helps its discourse because it keeps it alive. This is exactly what the BJP is looking for. For instance, when they use a term like palayan, which is exodus, their charge was that in Uttar Pradesh, there was an exodus of Hindus before 2014 because they weren't allowed to do their business by the Muslims in their area. Now, when you're using a word like palayan, exodus, again, it is contextualized in Pakistan. जैसे उस समय हुआ था, बिल्कुल वैसे ही हो रहा है. So everything has a partition context, which is how the political discourse is being informed at the moment.
So Munizae, can I come to you and ask you, obviously you're a child of Pakistan, a young child of Pakistan, but as you were growing up, did your parents sort of talk to you about the partition, the horrors of partition? What are your, what have you inherited? What are the stories that you were told? And if you look at Pakistan today, what do people say about improving relations with India as well as with Bangladesh? And I'll come to the Bangladesh question in a bit. Can't hear you, Munizae.
Well, yes, of course, I was told stories about partition. In fact, as a journalist, I did a whole documentary on people who remembered partition and who had stories to tell about partition, who were actually directly involved in the politics at that time. But of course, my grandmother came on the last train that came from India to Pakistan, and she described how she was saved and her family was saved, but everybody else was killed on that train. They had gone on a holiday to Simla when partition had taken place. So of course my grandparents talked about it. Both my grandmothers talked about it. My grandmother was the first woman to do a PhD in Persian literature from FC College, and she told me how all her friends who were doing, and she was one of the first Muslim women there, so everybody else was Hindu. And she told me how there was an exodus from universities, how young students went, and how she never saw her friends again. And then later on, when borders were reopened, some of her friends came to see her and to see the university. So I remember those times. I remember when she would wait and so excitedly cook her favorite things when her friends come. So of course, there are those. I think we will probably be the last generation to know a generation that had seen partition. But as Radhika was saying, the memory will become weaker and weaker, and the romance will become weaker. I think that's the real dilemma here for North, Pakistan, and for North India, where the borders meet. There is a romance, and that romance will be gone in a couple of years. So our relationship has to be built on something much more tangible, which will bring both our generations on either side some kind of low hanging fruits, as they say, of peace. Regarding Bangladesh, I think I come from a very unique family, in the sense that my grandfather, my nana, was in a very high profile position in the Awami League of Bangladesh, but on the side of West Pakistan. And so he was also imprisoned as a result of that. And he kept on, he was one of the few politicians that kept saying that what we are doing in Bangladesh is not right. And also talked about how the radio, how the media at that time was censored. And, the people of Pakistan were misled into believing that we were winning the war, when one fine day they woke up to news that we'd actually lost the war. So I think that was one of the few houses that people used to come and they used to listen to BBC, or they used to talk to my grandfather to know exactly what was happening at that time in Dhaka. And his letter is actually there in the Dhaka University, which he wrote to Mujibur Rahman, apologizing for what had happened. And as Aasha was saying, there has been somewhat of a veiled apology in 1974 by Zulfikar Ali Bhutto. And then in 2002, when Musharraf was there on an official trip to, I think, one of the war memorials at Sawar, I think. And he also, in some ways, apologized for what had really happened in Bangladesh. But I remember there was the Hamudur Rahman Commission report, which was the only report that investigated what happened in 1971. That was kept confidential for many, many years, in fact, decades. And when I was a student, it was revealed. And we read sentence by sentence of the absolute horror that went on in Bangladesh. And it started a national debate at the time amongst young people of what the army was capable of. But unfortunately, all such commissions in Pakistan, whether that be the Osama bin Laden Commission or any other commission, the reports have never really come out. They have always been kept secret. So this is not just because it was on Bangladesh, but that has been the pattern in Pakistan, unfortunately. And I do believe that if politicians had their way in Pakistan, especially I'm talking for the Pakistani politicians, I do not think that the situation would have been this bad between India, our neighbor, and Bangladesh. I believe that there would have been more constructive accords between the two countries, and there would be a recognition that people need to move forward. I think it's very unfortunate that we've had either direct military rule or indirect military rule, and that has hampered our foreign relations with other countries.
But Munizae, surely Imran Khan, your prime minister, he's a very, very smart, a very intelligent man. And perhaps, even if there was the veiled apologies have been made in the past, like you said, perhaps he could or should gather up the courage. He's been a cricketer in the past. He's played with Bangladeshi cricketers. I mean, South Asians have played together a lot these past decades. Surely he should or could gather up the courage to say, listen, what happened in 1971 was terrible, like you are saying. and that for the sake of the region, we should all move on?
Well, perhaps he should. And actually, that's a question for one of his supporters. So I can't say what Imran Khan would or would not say. I think Imran Khan focus since he has come into power has largely been on the opposition. So I do not know whether he has that mind space right now to think of anything else. But I would like to say that when politicians do come in on their own steam, they carry a very different mandate.
Mm-hmm. Absolutely. Aasha Mehreen, can I ask you, you talked about the fact that Pakistan still hasn't apologized for what happened in 1971, the atrocities, the horror, the absolute mayhem that was unleashed. Thousands of people were killed. I think we know that story. But can I also say that what's happening inside Bangladesh today, and while your story is a story that all of us in the region have read over and over again, so many books have come out, and it's something that will always be there as part of our common history. But surely, may I suggest that Bangladesh is in a sense reveling in its victimhood a little bit. Now, even if the Pakistanis don't make a formal apology and say, "Acha, maaf kar do," and let's move on, perhaps Bangladesh should also move on. And you guys have done fantastically on the economic front, but politically with Pakistan, you haven't been able to overcome that particular obstacle.
That's a very loaded question. Well, the thing is that I mean, this is of course my own view, and I think I share it with many other people, which is that and at the state level, unless there is some sort of a closure, and there has to be a sincere effort from Pakistan to say that they acknowledge what happened. But right now, I mean, even now, they don't officially acknowledge it.
Sure.
In that sense, I mean, apart from the few weak sort of attempts at apologies, and the thing is that at the ground level, I mean, as far as people are concerned, I mean, it's you have a mixed kind of mixed reactions among the people. There are people, I mean, because I think I would give credit to a lot of the academics and a lot of the journalists and artists. There have been a lot of collaboration with Pakistan and India, and those kind of activities do help definitely in at least understanding, because right now, as you said, I mean, I don't want to say victimhood, but there is a demonizing tendency that all Pakistanis are horrible,
bad.
Bad, and and an association with the people and the army, which is, I mean, obviously that's not the case,
right?
This is why it's so important for these kind of intellectual and artistic endeavors, these kind of collaborations which do create better understanding of people. And of course there's also direct connections with on a personal level. There are many Bangladeshis who have relatives in Pakistan, or who are
even today.
Yes, of course. But as Munizae was saying, that as time will move on, we don't really have much of a the window of opportunity is closing in, and the future generations, they may not have that emotional connection at all, and they that is a problem. That is a problem. But in order to move on, I think again I would have to say that there has to be a formal apology from the
state of Pakistan. Can I ask all three of you to talk about the minority in your country? In Bangladesh, for example, Aasha Mehreen, and if you could just talk a little bit about that. The Hindu minority is still quite substantial. And despite the fact that in large parts of India today, especially in the states that are neighboring Bangladesh, whether it's Assam, you've had the NRC, the CAA, the amendments, which of course nothing is, apart from the volatile situation a couple of years ago, nothing has happened on that front. But Bangladesh has, except for a couple of incidents recently, some months ago, where the Hindu temple was attacked. Now, tell me the situation between the Hindu and the minority Hindu and the majority Muslim communities in Bangladesh.
I think for the most part, there is, it's not at all comparable to what's happening in India. First of all, the minority is really a minority. They're very, it's not, I don't think there's any reason for major conflict to arise in that sense. But there have been these incidents, and these incidents are very, whether they're sporadic or they may not be on a very wide scale, but whatever little incidents that have taken place, those are very disturbing, and they're completely contradictory to all that we believe in, in terms of the liberation war and its ideals. These are complete contradictions to our constitution as well. And one of the reasons why this has happened is because there has been recently, I would say an import of a particular brand of Islam, which is very stringent, and I'm trying to be as diplomatic as possible.
Politically correct, yes.
You know what I mean? That it's not a it's a very hard line brand of the religion, and I don't think it's actually part of how Bangladesh has organically developed. It's kind of it's just come as a kind of a foreign import, and there are elements in Bangladesh who are trying to instigate this idea that we do not tolerate any minorities or anybody who's outside the religion. Even forget Hindus, even anybody who is following another school of thought of Islam, even that is not being tolerated. This is not a huge, it has not reached that point where I would say it's like really widespread, but it is happening. There are elements of that, and it's completely condemned by the government, which is a wonderful thing, that it's not tolerated by the government. But the thing is that at the same time, I would say that there are religious groups who get away with saying a lot of things, and they don't have the power to actually do much, but they do. The very presence of such a large number of people chanting things and saying things which are completely anti-state, and yet somehow they're more or less indulged, I would say. They're not, so that creates this problem. That, and I think that is probably a cause of some fear and uncertainty among the minorities.
Right. So we have just a few minutes left. So I'd like to ask all three of you for some ideas, suggestions on how we can move on. For Till Kingdom Come, you can talk about our differences, whether between majority, minority. So Radhika, can I ask you to talk a little bit about how, as if we have to, we are now 75 years old. If we have to sort of move, how do we move on from these traumas of our past? What do you think?
Yeah, I think there's no point romanticizing about people-to-people contacts anymore, the way I would have romanticized, say, 10, 15 years ago.
Okay.
I mean, that chapter is over.
Yeah, Radhika, you're pouring cold water on all our dreams.
It is unfortunate, I can't help. But, trade and commerce, for instance, I think Munizae said right in the beginning that let's have a working relationship. That's all I'm looking for at the moment, because I know in India, it's not possible to move beyond the kind of rhetoric, beyond the kind of discourse, beyond the propaganda that's being disseminated day after day. And the opposition is not exactly aggressive, Jyoti. You've seen it, In fact, on the question of minorities, on the question of Pakistan, all the parties become extremely defensive. So I do not see any kind of...
Why is that? Can you explain that? I mean, until recently, or say 10 years ago when the Congress party was in power, there were, people were crossing back and forth. There was music, whether it was artists or just normal people were going back and forth. Families, divided families were meeting each other. Why is the opposition, the Congress party and the others so defensive today?
Yeah, why? I mean, even during Vajpayee's time, I mean, you did have a lot of collaboration. Yeah, okay, and on the level of, on the level of civil society. But I think what has happened is that the BJP of today is a completely different BJP from the one that we had known earlier. Extremely hardline. They're not going to brook any compromises on Pakistan. I think they are very, very clear. That's the bedrock of their politics. So as long as BJP in this present form exists, that is the reason I said I don't see any scope for people-to-people contacts. I mean, just one quick example.
Sure.
When Advani went to Pakistan, I think it was in 2005, and it was a lovely trip, very pleasant and everything. And in Karachi, of course, he visited Jinnah's memorial. Yeah. And he wrote those, laudatory lines in favor of Jinnah, which was in order, I thought, which was called for. But, the PTI correspondent put out a flash, and within a couple of hours, we heard that there were huge protests in Gandhinagar, where the chief minister then was the present prime minister of India. And then the protest spread to some other states. And that was the last. I mean, that was the end of Advani's political career. It was a suicidal move as far as he was concerned. He probably didn't understand his party as well as some of the others did. Mm-hmm. So with this kind of an establishment, I do not see. So the best thing we can do is to try and establish some kind of a working relationship, which is conditioned by trade and commerce requirements. There's so much scope for, business partnerships between India and Pakistan. People from Pakistan want stuff from India. People from people in India want stuff from Pakistan. So I think, why not? Trade and commerce could be a starting point. Look, okay. I think at the end of the day, Jyoti, we have to accept that these are two sovereign countries who are free to pursue their own geopolitical relations. I mean, one doesn't have to be conditioned by the other. I frankly don't care who Pakistan is aligned with in the geopolitical context. And similarly, Pakistan shouldn't get het up if India becomes closer to a bloc or a country. We are two sovereign countries. But unfortunately, this whole thing has permeated our political discourse so deep that I do not see the possibility of even whatever I've mentioned happening in the near future. I am just asking for a working relationship between the two.
Okay. So now we've had this really interesting discussion, Munizae, but not once has the K word come up, Kashmir. Munizae, what's your take on? Do you think that for years we've talked about Pakistan has put Kashmir as a core issue and says that, if you don't resolve Kashmir, now, of course, Kashmir has been integrated into the Indian Union formally by the BJP government in 2019. And India has said, then we talked about the Security Council resolutions. Now, these are the two extreme positions. But in today's Pakistan, how important is this? And going forward, we only just have a few minutes left. Going forward, if you can give us one or two ideas of how we can move on.
Well, regarding Kashmir, I think one of the things that has we are being told now is that people want to move forward, that there needs to be trade between India and Pakistan. That is something that Razak Daud, who's the advisor on commerce and investment, said as well. So despite Kashmir being an issue, they are talking about, the government is talking about trade, the military establishment wants trade. And that is because they recognize that in order to prosper economically, they have to, recognize the potential on either side of trade, which is massive. And of course, we are holding a young population back when we are not making use of that. But I also want to say something that to what Radhika said, and with great respect to her, I think I disagree that the people-to-people contact is a dream. Not at all. I think it's a real reality. I mean, look at what happened in Kartarpur. Just recently, there were two brothers who met with each other after 40 years, and there were these images of them.
75 years. Since partition, they hadn't met. 75 years.
Since partition, they hadn't met, and they met each other crying. So till they are divided families on either side, till we speak the same language, till we dance to a Bollywood song, till you dance to an Abda Parveen song, till we recognize the sounds of our music, till we recognize the sounds of your music, till we speak the same language, we have the same Bhangra, how can you say that people-to-people contact is not a reality? It's a natural human state. And I think it's a natural human instinct to want to meet people who look like you, who speak like you, who think like you. And I think that there are a lot of similarities between India and Pakistan, which we cannot set aside, especially with divided families. We cannot set aside. And when you talk about the Kashmiris, who has suffered the most from this standoff between India and Pakistan is the Kashmiris. They are the ones who are bombed, on either side of the divide when our armies fight. They are the ones, mothers are separated from daughters. And they, as I said, they live only 30 kilometers from each other. So I think that when you have a divided history, a divided family, a divided nation, a divided culture, you can't just look at it clinically and say, "Bhai, trade yoga or trade se hi chalenge." It's not. Then you are not recognizing the shared history that you have together. And as far as politicians are concerned, I think politicians now live in a very different. When Mr. Adani came here, now you have social media, etc., and all of that. And whether you close the borders firmly or you do not, it does not mean that we cannot have conversations like this. So social media has transcended boundaries. It has transcended ideologies. And I think it has transcended in many ways what is the idea of a nation state and how a nation state makes people secure. So I think we are living in a very different world, and the states are at least 5 steps behind the people of their state. And I think that's what the people want. They want to move forward. And they want to move forward in a peaceful manner.
Absolutely. On this note, spoken very passionately and eloquently, as always, Munizae Jahangir. On this note, I think we'll have to end our session just as we were getting warmed up, actually. But it shows to me that the peoples of our countries at least need to talk to each other much more about the issues that confront us. And it's time that we discuss and debate all this in order to be able to move on. Thank you so much, Munizae Jahangir from Pakistan, Radhika Ramaseshan from New Delhi, India, and Aasha Mehreen Amin from Bangladesh. Thank you all.
Thank you, Munizae Jahangir, Aasha Mehreen Amin, Radhika Ramaseshan, and Jyoti Malhotra for a gripping session. Thank you all for watching and being such a great audience. Do stay logged on and continue to watch with us the series of exciting sessions that have been specially curated for you. And now for a Jaipur Writer Shorts.